Hey guys, this video is requested by GabrielPlaysCello, and he asks if I could make a video on how I learned to sight read. So I'm going to attempt to explain the process that I went through when I was starting off on the violin, so that you guys can have an idea of the approaches that I took and how I visualize where the notes are on the fingerboard. Sight reading is essentially being able to read music on paper and being able to translate that to the instrument that you're playing, and in my case it's the violin. But we all know that it's not as simple as it sounds, especially for non-fretted instruments like violin, viola, cello, or double bass, because it's hard to perceive where the notes are just by looking at them. So just to give you a little bit of background, I knew how to read music on paper from learning how to play the piano before. So I already had previous knowledge of music theory, and so my main concern was being able to translate that onto the fingerboard.
My main question was, how in the world was I going to find the notes beyond the first position?
So you may remember putting on white tapes across your fingerboard as a visual guide to show you exactly where the notes, where your fingers are supposed to land on the fingerboard. And you know, I think that they're very useful for newbies, but only for a certain period of time, because I found that when I had them, I would personally look at my fingers instead of listening for intonation. So after keeping them for about a month, I decided to take them all off. And of course, as soon as I removed all of my tapes, I began to have very keen senses into the distances between my fingers. And I would be able to orient my third finger to the fourth if I needed to, and my second to the first finger. And you know, it was like I was using my hearing to be able to find the notes and what I'm feeling around the fingerboard instead of looking. Plus, I really don't think it's ideal to be looking at your fingers constantly when you're reading music. It's awkward to be kind of looking here and then back to your music constantly. So the first month of learning how to read music on the violin, I was very confused with the fingerings because I was so used to having the thumb as the first finger. This is second, third, fourth, and fifth, as you would on the piano, and it was so confusing to me that whenever I see a second finger on the page, I would actually play with the first, and that's already like not being able to read properly on the violin. After playing through Suzuki Book 1, I very much was fascinated with finding out the rest of the notes up here, and of course I can't see them. So I tried to map out the notes on the fingerboard so that I can start shifting, because this was the point where I had discovered meditation and Schindler's List. So I wasn't very keen on continuing with the Suzuki repertoires because I was very distracted with the meditation and Schindler's List. And actually, you know, I say this a lot because I learned how to shift through those pieces, and I learned how to find notes in a higher position just by learning those beautiful, beautiful pieces. So now I will take you through a little bit of a visual so that you can see how I think about the fingerboard. Okay, so I'm just drawing out the strings of the violin, starting from the top to bottom, and on the right side is where the nut is. So I have G, D, A, and E strings, and then I'm just drawing out the names of the notes on first position with the second and third finger together, and this is actually how you would place your finger tapes on the violin, and it's a very specific measurement. So like I said, I kept them for about a month, and then I was thinking, how was I going to find the rest of the notes in higher positions? Then I came across this very interesting video that was explaining how the keyboard was related to the violin, and I was very interested to learn more. So I kept on watching, and basically I realized that the keyboard was an excellent way to visualize the notes on the fingerboard. And so as you can see here, the black notes are clearly divided from the white notes. And from watching the video that I was telling you about, you know, if we take this idea of stretching the keyboard to make room for the black notes to go in between the white notes, then we have this, which is what I'm trying to draw here at the bottom, which is a continuum of notes next to each other. So before, the black notes would be sharp or flat notes on the keyboard, and now it's a little bit different because now I'm trying to frame it in my mind that they are literally next to each other. So I'm just going to continue writing down the notes here, as you can see. And for a long time, this is actually how I approached finding the notes on the fingerboard. And then I decided to make this little visual guide for myself so that whenever I feel a little bit lost in higher position, I have something to refer to. And if you look closely, I highlighted all the natural notes so that it stands out in the guide, and the orange ones are basically a guide for me to think about it in positions. My approach was a little bit unconventional, and I know that there are many tried and true methods for developing fingerboard geography, especially for the violin, because of the many traditions behind this type of instrument. But I think that, I was embracing this idea that I don't have to have everything figured out before I can feel safe to explore outside of first position, and combine that with my eagerness to learn a piece like Meditation from Thais or the Schindler's List. It was like I was so taken by those pieces that I wanted to learn these things, and so I let myself just explore. So now that you've seen my little visual guide, I'd like to walk you through how I find these notes and how I keep myself oriented when I am moving into the higher positions. Okay, so in first position, the finger spacing pattern is so second and third finger are close together. And you know how etudes kind of train you to get used to this type of spacing pattern? For me, I was thinking about it as if I was playing it on the piano, which is if I had to go to a sharp note, for example G sharp, I go up a half step or a semitone. And basically I orient my third finger to my fourth, moving back and forth like that, and then same thing with the second finger here. I just move back and forth if I have to play F, which is the same as E sharp. So I think it's very handy to have music theory knowledge, especially when you're so used to doing scales on the piano. It's relatively easy to translate that on the violin, except the one thing that I want to stress is that knowing the theory is not enough to demonstrate that you understand the concept. It's the practice that counts a lot, because when you're playing during practice and it takes a long time to find these notes, you don't really know them. So that was the case with me. I knew it in theory, but you know, in practice it was difficult. I especially noticed it when I was learning some new repertoires. It would be very difficult to find them, and over time it becomes easier and becomes automatic, and that's the goal when you're reading new materials, is to shorten the time it takes to find that note. So you know, sometimes your brain goes through this very step-by-step thing where first you look at the note on the paper and you see that it's on a space, then you count how many on what number space is it on, and then in your mind you're thinking, oh, if it's a C, so that's the third space, where is it on the fingerboard? So that you kind of short circuit that way of thinking into like a reflex. It becomes a reflex to find these notes. And yeah, so that's my goal with doing the etudes and the scales. That's primarily what I think is going to help me to become a better sight reader, but also getting a feel for the intervals. So what does a major second feel, what does a minor second feel, and then major third, fourth, perfect fourth, and keeping a very good hand frame between the first and fourth finger is so important. When I was exploring the higher positions, I noticed that there are some patterns, and that would help me actually to become oriented in higher positions. So let's just do G string for now. So the first finger spacing pattern is 2 and 3 together, and if I play the first 5 notes of the G major scale, so that's G, A, B, C, D, and then to finish off the whole scale, so how do I find that note? Let's see. So if I place my first finger to where my fourth finger is, then I find fourth position, which is exactly the same as the next open string down. So this is the open string. So I think that looking back, it wasn't a hard thing for me to find the fourth position because it's exactly the same as the open string. So that's my first guide, and it, of course, it happens across all of the strings. If you go to the D string and play on the fourth position, that would be exactly the same as the next string down, next string up, which is A. And then if you go into the A string, there's the E, open E. Exactly the same notes. So I orient to the open strings in fourth position. Now, if I am playing with the third finger on the string, on the D string, I notice that it's exactly the same as the G string. So actually in the key of D, the G, open G, is my guide for staying in tune. Same thing with the next string, which is A string. This is the note D. So that's my guide for that. And then A. So these things starts to emerge as soon as I started shifting. If I touch the open D string while I'm playing the D and the A string, it should have this ping sound. So that's one way of staying oriented in the third position. And then of course the fourth, so the bridal march is a good way to like orally remember how it sounds like. So at the beginning it's very difficult to find that note, the fourth finger, because it's very far from the first finger. The first finger is easier to find because of all of this sensations that you feel around the neck of the violin, but the fourth is hard. I actually use my first finger as an anchor for my fourth finger. So that is hard, and I already knew at the beginning that if I'm going to move into the higher position, the distance between my 1 and 4th finger closes in and gets smaller. So that's a good thing to take note of as well. And of course there's the harmonic, so it's like a flute kind of sound. So I use this a lot to think about where I am in space. I'm not sure if I mentioned it yet, but I was doing the one finger scale exercise on one string. So for example, if I'm starting on A, that's a very out of tune scale. This is the unique thing about the violin, is that one note can be played in a different string, in 2 different strings. So when I was doing the 1 octave scale, I would play it in 1 string, and then I realized that these notes up here is exactly the same as the notes in first position on the next string.